Last week, we took a look at a recent research paper highlighting how some of these so-called climate solutions promoted by the fossil fuel industry are often just strategies to enable the continuation of oil and gas combustion for many more decades than is safe for our climate and environment. The sharp-eyed among you will have noticed that there was one particular strategy mentioned in the research paper that I didn't talk about at all in the video, and that was for good reason, because the technology in question is so egregious that it really deserves a whole video in its own right. So grab a drink and buckle up, folks, because we're about to take a deep dive into the murky world of biofuels. Hello, and welcome to Just Have a Think. I guess if you ask most people what green fuel looks like, they'd probably describe something like corn or sugarcane or possibly rapeseed or palm oil or something like that, and they'd be right, at least according to the companies that tout those fuels as green anyway. And after all, it is quite a compelling message on the face of it, isn't it? All those crops absorb carbon dioxide from our atmosphere as they grow. The processors harvest them and convert the natural oils and sugars in those crops into fuels like ethanol. Consumers burn those fuels in cars and trucks, and the carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere, ready to be reabsorbed by the next crop being grown on the plantations. No ancient carbon is being dug up, no fossil reserves are being plundered. It's just sunlight, photosynthesis, the natural properties of soil, and a nice tidy carbon cycle. And that's exactly why biofuels have proven to be so politically acceptable and resilient. They feel instinctively natural. They feel like a wholesome rural pursuit, helping hard-working farmers make a well-earned living. And of course, they allow our governments to claim that they're reducing fossil fuel dependence without forcing anyone to change their car or their truck or tractor, or even worry about the amount of flying they do. But the research paper we looked at in our previous video shows us that in fact biofuels may be one of the clearest examples of what the paper's authors call a false solution. That doesn't mean the authors are suggesting that all biofuels are inherently evil or useless. In fact, they're very careful not to make that claim. What they're examining instead is how biofuels are being deployed, by whom, and with what systemic consequences. And when you step back and look at the evidence as a whole, it turns out to be a much more complicated picture than the simple plants good, oil bad narrative we're presented with. But before we get stuck into the details, I'm very much hoping you might take a couple of seconds to click the like and subscribe buttons just down here. It costs you absolutely nothing at all, but it means this channel has a better chance of being noticed by the YouTube algorithm ahead of all the AI slop that's flooding the platform at the moment. If you've already subscribed, then you have my eternal gratitude. And if you haven't yet subscribed, then you would have my eternal gratitude if you did. So what was I on about then? Oh yeah, biofuels. We should really separate them out into different categories at this stage. Firstly, there are what's known as first generation biofuels, which are things like the corn ethanol, which is so popular in the United States, sugarcane ethanol, which runs a good chunk of all the cars in Brazil, palm oil biodiesel in Southeast Asia, and rapeseed biodiesel here in Europe. Then there are second generation or so-called advanced biofuels. These are products like cellulosic fuels made from crop residues, switchgrass and agricultural waste. And then there's my particular favourite phrase, sustainable aviation fuel or SAF, which the airline operators are now heavily promoting as their pathway to net zero and your peace of mind next time you decide to pop off to Torremolinos for a cheeky weekend away. And as I mentioned just now, all these options tick a very big popularity box for our politicians. Consumers hardly notice any difference to their lifestyle and can go about their business with a clear conscience, safe in the knowledge that they're apparently doing their bit for the environment. And the new fuels slot almost perfectly into the current fossil fuel infrastructure, so the policymakers can keep the lobbyists happy as well. I recently spoke with Jeff Dembicki, Global Managing Editor of DSMOG, to get an idea of what his investigations have revealed.
Anytime that two or more highly polluting industries manage to find common ground, that just makes them more powerful in advocating for some sort of polluting product or industry. And we saw a real example of this at the recent COP30 climate talks in Brazil, where the huge Brazilian state oil producer Petrobras was loudly advertising its support for biofuels at the same time that the huge agribusiness lobby in Brazil was also pushing for that.
Refineries can be converted into biorefineries with relatively minor technical changes. Pipelines don't need rebuilding, petrol stations don't need redesigning, and internal combustion engines can carry on just as they always have done without all this kerfuffle about batteries and recharging and all the rest of it. In other words, biofuels allow the system to continue functioning largely unchanged. And that's why they're so dangerous. Because unlike electrification, which fundamentally reduces oil demand, biofuels allow combustion to remain central to the global energy system. And according to the authors of this paper, that makes them the perfect solution for incumbent fossil fuel companies, not because they dramatically reduce emissions, but because they don't pose an existential threat to the core business model. But hang on, Dave, I hear you cry. You've just explained the circularity of the biofuel system, haven't you? Surely that's fundamentally different from digging up oil and gas for a one-time combustion hit. Well, sort of, yes. But to get to the nub of the issue, we really need to talk about land, and land use specifically. Government statistics for the US Department of Agriculture tell us that ethanol manufacturers use about 40% of the US corn crop for ethanol and related co-products. That's about 37 million acres, or about 57,000 square miles, which is an area the size of the state of Illinois. So that's really not a marginal side hustle, is it? It's an enormous land commitment for growing a crop that will never feed a single US citizen. But the profligacy of growing plants for fuel really jumps out when you consider what else that land could be used for. A Cornell University study found that 1 hectare covered in solar panels produces as much energy as 31 hectares of corn grown for ethanol. So if we just converted about 3% of the land now used for ethanol to solar, we produce the same amount of energy, but with far less land, no fertilizer, and far fewer emissions. Or if we turn it around and look at it from the other direction, according to the ever-brilliant Our World in Data, if all the land currently used globally to grow crops for liquid biofuels, which by the way is an area roughly the size of Poland, were covered in solar panels, that land could produce about 32,000 terawatt hours of electricity per year, which equates to roughly the annual electricity consumption of the entire planet. Why such a big difference? Well, because biofuels convert sunlight into chemical energy via photosynthesis, which is an inherently inefficient process, even assuming you get a perfect harvest every year, which these days is by no means a given, is it? According to good old Wikipedia, a typical crop plant has a sunlight to biomass efficiency of between 1 and 2%. By contrast, solar panels convert sunlight directly into electricity with efficiencies well above 20%, and it's a technology that's improving all the time. Theoretically, that means you could free up 97% of the land, either to grow food crops for human consumption, or even, heaven forfend, leave the land alone and allow it to rewild in the way that nature dictates, restoring the balance of nutrients and subterranean microbial life that drives effective carbon sequestration. Now, of course, the biofuel producers will tell us that their activities are carbon neutral because the plants absorb CO2 while they're growing. And that's true, as I mentioned earlier, at least at the level of an individual plant anyway. But the full life cycle of the industrial scale process can be way more complicated. Forests are often cleared to provide vast areas for growing profitable fuel crops. And when you clear a forest, you generally release large amounts of stored carbon, especially if the forestry area is burnt instead of harvested for timber. And if a landowner decides they can make more profit from biofuels and turns over their agricultural land that was previously used for human food to growing crops for biofuels instead, then that human food production has to move somewhere else, doesn't it? Potentially driving even more deforestation in a different region. It's a problem the industry and organisations like the IPCC called indirect land use change, or ILUC. And when ILUC is factored in, some analyses, including recent reports from groups like the European Federation for Transport and Environment, find that certain biofuels emit as much or even more CO2 than the fossil fuels they replace. It's not just the USA either, although that country is by far the worst offender, as this chart clearly shows. Brazil, Europe, Indonesia, and several other countries dominate the global biofuel market, with demand expected to rise by 40% by 2030. And that's one of the key points made by the authors of the paper we looked at last week. They argue that biofuels can shift socio-ecological costs to marginalised regions, particularly in the global south, while maintaining fuel consumption patterns in wealthier economies. Palm oil biodiesel is an obvious example. Biofuel feedstocks cultivated in tropical regions can feed biorefineries in Europe, allowing fuel blending mandates to be met, while land use pressures and ecological impacts are borne elsewhere. And then there's something called the coalition effect. It's a wonderfully sanitised term for what is essentially a tightly intertwined gang of operators, all controlling one or more aspects of our lives. So we've got agribusiness, farmers, airlines, refiners, and governments creating powerful cross-sector alliances. If you criticise ethanol mandates in the USA, you're not just challenging energy policy, you stand accused of challenging rural livelihoods, when in fact many of those folks would be far better off using a small percentage of their land for solar power generation or for agrivoltaics. If you question sustainable aviation fuel, you're castigated for undermining the aviation industry's apparent efforts to achieve their climate strategy. You get the idea. It's all sewn together nicely to make it very difficult to call out biofuels as a poorly thought through commercial and political strategy. According to the paper's authors, that difficulty actually helps insulate the broader fossil fuel system from structural disruption, because instead of shrinking the liquid fuel market, biofuels expand the number of actors invested in preserving it. And since I've mentioned the aviation industry, let's take that one as a specific example. Despite some Herculean efforts and some significant successes with short-haul battery electric aircraft, most analysts agree that electrifying aircraft for medium and long-haul flights is not a realistic prospect, at least not with the battery chemistry that we have at our disposal today anyway. Hydrogen as an aviation fuel has been investigated by the big dogs like Boeing and Airbus, and quietly shelved as an unrealistic prospect for all the same reasons that trying to pump it into existing gas pipelines is equally stupid. Hydrogen takes up a massive volume at room temperature, so it either has to be cryogenically frozen into liquid or massively compressed. It also leaks because it's the smallest atomic structure in the known universe, and it embrittles the metal pipework and containers that it sits in, because as the walls of those materials expand slightly with temperature and pressure changes, hydrogen atoms sneak into the tiny little molecular gaps that form, which means the material can never fully close up again when it contracts. Hydrogen is an amazing element and incredibly useful in certain applications, but replacing gas networks and fueling airplanes are definitely not two of them. So biofuels have been cleverly rebranded, presumably by some uber expensive PR agency somewhere, to become sustainable aviation fuels or SAFs, and they're now the aviation industry's flagship solution.
And so with sustainable aviation fuels, that could be a legitimate market for some advanced biofuels. But we haven't seen the necessary funding commitments or strategic commitments from oil and gas companies to actually make that a reality. One good example of that is Exxon's support over the years for advanced algae-based biofuels. Exxon had an apparent commitment to moving forward these algae-based biofuels, and it spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to develop them over the years. At the same time, Exxon was also spending huge amounts of money on advertising the fact that it was investing in these biofuels. This is a great example of a solution that could potentially have, an important impact on a certain market. But even inside the company, Exxon executives were clear that they weren't investing nearly enough money in the actual production and commercialization of these biofuels to make any sort of difference.
SAFs may be a better solution than crude oil-derived kerosene, and if they're made from waste materials, then they may well have a role. But that waste supply is severely limited. There's only so much used cooking oil and animal fats to go around, and that means if SAF demand is to scale up to meet aviation growth projections, dedicated energy crops become an unavoidable reality, which means we're back to our land problem again. It may be some decades before we work out how to do long-haul flight without combustible fuels, but for short-haul stuff, battery chemistries for electric planes are coming along leaps and bounds. And although this might sound like heresy in the USA, France has legally banned certain short-haul domestic flights where there's a viable rail alternative, and China's getting very close to perfecting a magnetic levitation train that can travel at speeds of up to 600 miles an hour. So, trains, electric trains. Just a thought. In fairness, some biofuels are less impactful than others. Brazil's sugarcane ethanol performs better on a life cycle analysis basis than US corn ethanol, for example. Some advanced biofuels may offer real benefits, and if managed very carefully, then agricultural residues and genuine waste streams could provide lower carbon alternatives without massive land expansion. And let's not forget that there are plenty of rural economies that currently depend almost entirely on the biofuel market remaining buoyant. The authors of this research are not suggesting that every litre of biofuel is a climate crime. What they're questioning is the systemic role biofuels are playing. Biofuels may have limited roles in specific sectors, but if they become a substitute for genuine fossil fuel phase down, then they risk doing more to protect the status quo than to transform it. And that, ultimately, is the question we need to ask. Are biofuels helping us move beyond fossil fuels, or are they helping fossil fuels evolve just enough to survive? I've left a link in the description to the open source research paper so you can read it in full and draw your own conclusions. And I'm sure you'll all have your own strong views on this one, so as always, the place to leave your thoughts is in the comment section below. That's it for this week though. Thanks as always to the amazing group of people over at Patreon who enable me to keep ads and sponsorship messages out of all my videos. You can join them and get the chance to critique early access versions of all my videos and take part in monthly content polls and chat directly with me by visiting patreon.com/justhavathink. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this video useful. And most important of all, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.